My name is Scott Ambler, and I'm from IBM, and I'd like to share some techniques for scaling Agile software development. Many of you might have heard that Agile, or have been led to believe that Agile is only for small, co-located teams. That's simply not true. So I'm going to describe some strategies that have been shown to work in practice to scale Agile to much larger and much more complex situations. So that's the focus of my talk for the next 40 minutes or so. So anyways, my background, I'm the practice leader of Agile development at IBM Rational. And so my job is to help ourselves become more agile, but also, more importantly, help our clients become more agile. So I'm mostly customer facing, even though I do some internal work. I also work for a magazine called Dr. Dobbs Journal. I'm going to share some industry numbers with you for who's doing Agile, how they're doing it, and all that good sort of stuff. I'm a firm believer in having fact-based arguments. And unfortunately, when you talk about software process, most of the arguments are religious in nature. And the traditional community, the waterfall community, relies on religious arguments because the facts don't back up what they're talking about. So anyway, beware of that. And I think this is an important thing to observe, is that traditional software development, the stuff we've been told to do for 30 or 40 years now, is based on theory. Most of that theory has been shown to be false. And this is one of the reasons why Agile is becoming so widespread, is because it's based on practice. And it's a big difference. It actually works. So anyways, we'll see some of that. I've written a few books. I've written some of the key books for scaling Agile. I'll talk about Agile modeling in a bit, but I'll also talk about a little bit about Agile database techniques. There's nothing special about databases and about data work. You can, in fact, be Agile with that. Now, unfortunately, the data community is almost the epitome of not being Agile, but that's a choice. So we can actually bring the quality techniques and the discipline that we see in the Agile world into the data world as well. So that's some of the things I've been working on. So if anybody tells you that you can't change a database schema easily, that's simply not true. It's actually quite trivial, something I wrote in that book. And actually, one of the speakers today is going to talk about Team Studio, and the new version of Team Studio for database professionals. It actually has a lot of material in there based on my work, particularly in this book, but I guess as well as in this book, for doing database refactoring and good stuff like that. So the tools are coming out there, so it's good to see. So anyways, let's get into it. So I'm going to talk about two basic topics here. I'll explore the Agile adoption rate a bit. Now most of these numbers are North American, so you'll have to take them for what they are. And then I'll discuss how do you scale Agile, and I'll explore the issues. So, because a lot of the time, people think when they think about scaling, they think only about large project teams or about distributed teams. And yeah, that's important, but there's more issues to scaling than that. And I think this is something that the Agile community needs to get a bit better at. But anyways, and I'll leave you with a few ideas. I always like to start off with a warning. I'm a fairly blunt person. I believe in calling it like it is. So I'll share some ideas. So some of these might confirm some suspicions you've had. It's interesting. I have the privilege of going into organizations around the world. And as a result, one of the things I get to do is I get to observe what works and what doesn't work. And I see very common patterns of failure in many organizations. And it's interesting that I was in at a couple clients this morning, and their problems were fairly predictable. And because as soon as I found out that a few key pieces of information, like the way they approached requirements and the way they approached testing, and the way they approached budgeting, I pretty well knew. I could list off all the rest of the problems in your departments, because once you make a couple key decisions like that, everything else seems to follow. So as a result, and I think it's important for a group like this that on the breaks, talk with each other. And what you'll discover when you do that is that your organizations are all suffering from the same basic challenges, and because you're making the same basic mistakes. And unfortunately, in the traditional world, a common reaction is to throw more bureaucracy at the problem. If only we were following more complex processes, if only we were writing more documentation, if only we were doing more sign-offs, things would be better. No, that actually makes the problem even worse. So observe that. So, if you get a chance, talk with each other, and you'll discover that there's a few things. So anyway, so be skeptical, be open. Everything I'm going to talk about works in practice, and I've seen it done, and almost always I've done it. So I'm not going to share any theory. I'm not going to share any theory with you. If I do, I will point the theory out, and I'll make it very obvious when I am talking about theory. But at the same time, please don't make any career-ending moves. So some of the things I'm going to talk about, even though they work very well, your organization might not be able to tolerate that level of success, because choosing to succeed is a very difficult thing to do. It's very easy to choose to fail. It's very easy to choose to do the things that are comfortable, even though they don't work very well. So you need to get out of that rut, and you need to start choosing. But at the same time, don't get yourself fired. So just because there's very coherent evidence that writing a detailed requirement specification is actually a reasonably bad practice, that doesn't mean that your organization will allow you to stop writing requirements documents tomorrow. So even though that would be a good thing. And one of the speakers has a very coherent story for why executable specifications instead of static specifications are very good ideas. But anyways, we'll see what happens there. Okay, there we go. Okay, so who's doing this stuff? So I'm going to share some data from 2 different surveys that we've done. For whatever reasons, this one was mostly North American. This one, was also mostly North American, although there is some European data there. If you want to crunch the numbers yourself, one of the things that I do whenever I run a survey is I share the data with the world. So you can go to this page and you can get the original source questions as they were asked. You can also get the source data with the exception of people's emails due to privacy reasons, as well as a summary PowerPoint slide deck. So you can actually crunch these numbers yourself. So these are open surveys. I don't want to be in a position where I get, I've been accused of bias in some of the surveys, and it was interesting. In this survey, I got dinged by the academic community for running a biased survey because the results were that Agile projects are more successful than traditional projects, which is not what people want to hear in the traditional community. So I got accused of bias on that. So I said, oh, this could be a problem. So I did further analysis of the data, and I did discover bias towards traditional. And so I thought that, so that was sort of really, so my response was, yeah, you're right, there is bias here, but it's on your side of the fence, not on my side of the fence. And, but you could, you please do the, crunch the data yourself and see what you get. And that sort of ended the conversation because it was leaning towards traditional, even though the numbers worked out better for the Agile folks. So anyways, let's get into it. So anyways, last March in the adoption survey, we found that 69% of organizations had 1 or more Agile projects underway. 85% of this part of the pie was doing multiple Agile projects, which leads me to believe that we've gone beyond the pilot project phase for most organizations now, and they're taking it seriously. And this is because this is what I'm seeing when I go into companies, is that they very quickly start adopting Agile because it works better. Of the people that said no, 25% of them said that they thought they would be doing Agile sometime during 2007. So we're going to run this survey again in about a month from now, and we'll find out what actually happened. These numbers are up from the previous year as well, although I don't have the exact figures from 2006. So this is good. It was interesting. When we ran this survey in 2006, we had the most pessimistic numbers in the industry. Our adoption rate was the lowest one reported for 2006. I haven't gone back and done an analysis of the various adoption surveys for 2007, but I suspect we're also the lowest as well, because Dr. Dobbs has a very wide-ranging readership. We've got a bunch of traditional people, a bunch of Agile people, and everything in between. So as a result, I think our numbers are probably a little bit better than what we see from, say from Agile Journal or from some of the Agile vendors that run surveys, because they have more Agile customers than Dr. Dobbs does. In the project success survey, the goal of that survey was to explore how organizations define success. In the IT industry, we have this very unfortunate challenge where we've had a lot of theory forced on us over the years. One of the theories is that the definition of project success is that a project should be on time, on budget, to specification. That's a theory. and it doesn't hold. So if you look at the industry numbers, when people measure project success against that, the chaos report from the Standish Group reports a 34% success rate. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't observe that in practice. I see for years I've seen a significantly higher success rate. So we started questioning it at Dr. Dobbs, and because we couldn't figure it out, because the numbers did not reflect reality in our opinion. So we figured, well, maybe the assumption is wrong. Maybe that is not the way people define success. So we explored this. So what we did, we asked them, what do you value? What's important to you? So 87% of respondents said that high quality is an important thing. They'd rather have, they want high quality software, which, what the other 13% is thinking, I'm not so sure, but they would rather have high quality software than something that's crappy, but that's on time and on budget. 87% also said they would rather have software which meets their needs as opposed to software that fulfills the specification. Okay? So, and this is interesting because this reflects the fact that the Standish Group has numbers that show that when you do a requirement specification at the beginning of a project and get it and then work to that specification, that on average 47% of the functionality that you deliver will never be used. So you have almost half of your development budget gets wasted when you do a big requirement spec up front. Okay? So we're not fooling anybody. So this is interesting. Right? Our users inherently know that building software to specification is not such a good idea because they're the ones that are suffering from these problems. But they don't know to ask any better sometimes. So they would rather have something that meets their needs. So it's interesting, and this is what Agile is all about. We build working software on a regular basis, and we embrace change. We let people change their minds. We focus on quality. We refactor our code. We do more testing. We do test-driven development. As a result, we have greater quality than what you see in the traditional world. 80% would rather spend the money wisely. They want to have the best return on investment. They're not interested as much in having a system delivered under budget. They'd rather spend the money wisely. So they inherently know that these upfront budgets that we're doing aren't so accurate, which isn't news to anybody. Even the budgeting community will tell you that. It's not, we know we're not very good at doing estimation. So maybe we should stop trying, right? We're not fooling anybody with these traditional techniques. 75% would rather have a healthy workplace than delivering on time and on budget. Now, unfortunately, when you look at the data from just the business people, only 50% was interested in a healthy IT workplace. So if they burned out the IT staff to get their system out the door, that was okay with half of the stakeholders. So that's sort of bad news for us. So we're expendable, in their minds. So we got to watch this. 61% would rather have the system when it's ready to be shipped as opposed to having it on time. Okay? Nobody wants crap on time. They'd rather have something that works properly. So then what we did, so once we explored how people actually define success, we asked them, so as you define success, as opposed to how the academics and the U.S. military tells you how to define success, because that's where the source of on time, on budget to spec is the U.S. military, if you trace it back. But anyways, don't get me going on that topic. But when you ask them in your own terms, how are projects successful, Agile has a 71% success rate. Traditional approaches, either for just a traditional project or a data warehousing project, which is almost always traditional, have a 63% success rate, and offshoring has a 43% success rate when success is defined in your own terms. So I thought that's a fairly interesting thing to observe. So Agile is lower risk. I was actually in a company this morning where they were doing 50 projects a year, and they were thinking whether or not to try Agile. Well, try one, right? So if you've got 50 projects in a year, well, try one Agile. It's only 2%. It's trivial, right? So this is why looking at the numbers can sometimes be a critical thing for us. So anyways, there's some decent evidence that Agile seems to be working better. In the adoption survey, we also asked, I wanted to go beyond the Agile rhetoric, right? Because this is one of the challenges in the Agile community. It's just like the traditional community has its religion, the Agile community has its religion. And we make a lot of religious-based arguments, like, trusting to do tomorrow's work tomorrow. Thanks for sharing your religion with me. Might not always be the best idea. And I've seen enough project teams shoot themselves in the foot with that strategy to know that maybe we should be doing a little bit of modeling up front. So I'll share some stats on that in a bit. But anyways, some of the rhetoric in the Agile community is you got to be co-located. So yes, but we didn't have any numbers on that. So I thought I'd go look for numbers. So I asked, so this slide's hard to read, but anyway, so what's going on here? These are percentages along the bottom. And what we asked was, what's the relative success rate of Agile projects with different types of strategies? So on average, this is the high, 90% or more of the Agile projects are successful, between 75 and 90 and so on. So what we found was that co-located projects, on average, were in fact more successful than not co-located. So we asked for three different types of projects. Co-located, where you're in the same room, working together, including your stakeholders, so you can easily talk with the business people. Not co-located, so maybe you're in the same building, but you're in different cubes or on different floors, or you're at least in the same city, so if you had to get together, you could easily. And then offshoring, where some or most of the team is in a significantly different location. So some of them are in Budapest, some are in Toronto, some are in Mumbai, right? So that sort of situation. So a couple of points here. First, sure enough, co-located is in fact more successful than not co-located, which in turn is more successful than offshoring. It's not news, but it's nice to have the numbers, right? But people are succeeding at not being not co-located, and they're succeeding at Agile offshoring. Also nice to have the numbers on that. Now, we're not that good at these things yet. Some of the tools are not in place, and some of the techniques are not well adopted. So we're going to ask this question again in about this coming March, because I want to see the trends. Because I think what's happening, I know for a fact, at least internally within IBM, we're getting a lot better at Agile offshoring. So it'll be interesting to see what the industry trends are on that one. So anyways, you don't have, it's a very good idea to be co-located, but it's not required. So keep that in mind. We also asked about team size. This chart is combining the answers from two questions. So we asked, what is the largest Agile project you ever attempted, and versus what is the largest project size Agile project that you've ever been successful at? So for example, we had, 65 respondents said that the largest Agile project they were ever successful at was 11 to 20, versus 80% said that was the biggest one that they'd ever attempted. So that's the way you read that. Now these two graphs here, these two bars here look strange, but they're actually true. So this is why I share the data. But anyway, so what happens is a very common thing that we saw was that companies would get good at one size. They would have they'd get good at one size, even though they would have attempted the next size up and not been very good at it. Which makes sense, right? As you learn, you get things. You start with a small team, get good at that. Next project, you try something a little bit bigger, and until you get that right, then you try something bigger. So this is the type of thing we're seeing. So we're going to ask this question again this coming year. This is this is the number of people on the team. Yeah. So the point is that there are some organizations that are doing very large projects and succeeding at them. Internally within IBM, we've had several Agile projects of over 200. I know for a fact that GBS, Global Services, has done Agile projects of over 200 people successfully for clients. So this is happening. So don't let anybody tell you it has to be small teams. We also asked about iteration length. Even though a lot of people talk about 4 weeks, the most popular iteration length industry-wide seems to be 2 weeks. We've run the same survey internally with IBM, got pretty much the exact same results, which I thought was interesting. So that's good. So shorter is generally better than longer, because the longer your iteration, the greater at risk you are, because more than likely you're going to start doing mini waterfalls, and you're going to start fooling around, right? So if you've got 6-week iterations or 8-week iterations, what's going to happen the first couple weeks, you'll be doing paperwork and not really doing anything, and then you won't really get serious about it until the third or 3 or 4 weeks in when you actually you're getting close to actually having to deliver something. So shortening the iteration squeezes the nonsense out of the projects. So that's probably a good thing. I've been on projects, Agile projects, where we had 1-day iterations. A bit extreme, but it worked. So who's to say, right?
How much is the overhead on that? Considering the sprint planning meeting and all the other stuff, you have an overhead for 1-day sprints. How big is that?
It's a little bit shorter. What's happening now is, okay, so the overhead, percentage-wise, is probably a little bit bigger. So for a 1-day iteration, you'd have you're going to have your sprint meeting anyways, but you're also going to do your planning for the day in the sprint meeting. So you end up with like a half-hour begin the day meeting. Well, you're not going to have a retrospective on 1-day iterations. So, you'll do that maybe every Friday afternoon or something. Yeah, so yeah, things get different when you start shortening the iterations. Yeah. I personally like 2 weeks myself, but that happens. Okay, so how do you scale Agile software development? So a couple things. First, when you read a lot of the Agile literature, it seems pretty naive. There seems to be this underlying assumption that you're in this co-located room, you're doing greenfield development, you're in complete control of the destiny, your stakeholders can show up every day and they can be on site. You have a big group hug every morning, everybody loves working together, you're all a bunch of professionals and all this sort of stuff, right? No legacy issues to deal with, everything works out fine. All the planets are aligned. Well, if that's your situation, great. But what if it's not, right? What happens if you're geographically distributed? You got team members in different cities, different countries, whatever, right? Suddenly it becomes a little more complex. What happens if you have regulatory compliance issues? You've got some government guidelines you have to follow, right? You get Basel II or Sarbanes-Oxley or whatever else, right? Bad news. Suddenly things become a little more complex. What happens if it's not this big group hug situation where you've got some people in your organization that not only aren't Agile, they're adamantly opposed to it? What happens when you've got data groups that absolutely insist on a big logical data model up front, even though they couldn't possibly justify that? What do you do? What happens when you've got legacy systems in place and there's no tests? What do you do, right? So it becomes more complex. What happens if you're organizationally distributed? You've got contractors in place. You've got different divisions. You've got different companies working together. You've got people from different countries. Like, God help you if you're involved in any sort of government work in the European Union, right? You're going to have multiple countries involved, and they're all scrapping it out, and years later you'll make a decision not to do it. So bad news, right? More complex. And this happens, and it doesn't just happen in Europe, obviously. It's bad news. What happens if you want to get good at governance? Okay, now this is something that the Agile community doesn't like talking about. But the reality is, if you have an IT department doing one or more projects, and I have to think that's your situation, otherwise, what are you doing here? Then you have an IT governance in place. Whether or not that governance program is explicit is an issue, and whether or not it's effective is an issue. Most governance programs seem to be rather ineffective. And the reason why is because governance is often left to the bureaucrats. And when you leave governance to the bureaucrats, surprise, surprise, you will end up with a bureaucratic governance process, right? So part of my message to the Agile community is time to grow up and accept the fact that there's some non-sexy things that we need to deal with. Because if we don't take responsibility for the bigger issues, we're going to have these crazy governance programs enforced upon us. Okay, that might not be a good strategy. So anyways, we need to deal with this. What happens if we got big teams? What happens if we have very complex applications? Suddenly things become more complex, right? So this is what happens at scale. So scaling is not just a team size thing and not just a distribution thing. The things that, is the popular issues right now to be dealing with, we have all these other factors as well. And any given project will be in different situations, will find themselves in different situations. And this makes it hard for management. There's this concept of having repeatable processes. Everybody follows the same process and everything will work out. That is completely naive. Repeatable process is not the issue. Repeatable results are. And that's big difference. So if I've got different teams in different situations, they will have to follow different processes or at least different flavors of the same process. Because inherently we know a team of 3 people works differently than a team of 30 people, right? Obviously. We know that a team building a data warehouse will work differently than a team building a website, than a team building a packaged software, than a team building satellite software. We know this, right? We're going to have different processes for that. We know that a team that's co-located will work differently than a team that's distributed, obviously. So this is something that can be pretty tough in a lot of organizations. So scaling really requires great flexibility. So the part of the message here is that Agile's relative. Different teams are going to find themselves in different situations. You're going to follow different processes. You'll have different combinations of tools. So what works well for a small co-located team will be a complete disaster for a distributed team of 200 people, right? So we need to start respecting that. You know, a team that has compliance issues will do more documentation than a team that does not. So, you know, the world's different. So what are some of the techniques that you can use to scale Agile software development? One of them actually comes from me is Agile modeling. So the idea here, now modeling and documentation are not the most popular concepts amongst the Agile community, and yet we're all doing it. So in the Agile adoption survey, I started looking into what levels of modeling are people doing. 93% of Agilists are doing whiteboard sketching. Well, that's modeling. 66% are doing paper modeling, which I thought was strange because considering all the talk that we hear about index cards and post-it notes and almost nothing about whiteboarding, and yet far more people are doing whiteboarding. So anyways, and they're both good. I'm a firm believer in index cards, don't get me wrong. People are doing, here's where we go against the Agile religion. People are doing some initial Agile requirements modeling. They're doing some initial architecture modeling. Because in the real world, not in Agile fantasy land, not in what you read in the mailing list, but in the real world, you get asked really weird questions at the beginning of a project like, what are you going to build? How much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? How are you going to build it? And the only way you can answer those questions is you've got to do some initial modeling. You know, the Agilists love to talk about stacks of requirements, right? Well, where does that stack come from? Does it get beamed down from the Starship Enterprise and magically appear on your desk on Monday morning, the first day of the project? No. You do some initial modeling to get those requirements. We need to talk about this. We need to get better at this. These are basic fundamental things that we need to communicate to the rest of the world what we're actually doing because it freaks the traditionalists out. What do you mean you're not doing it? Well, yeah, you're using a metaphor to drive your project architecture? Are you crazy? What kind of a nut job would do that? Nobody does that. They get to a whiteboard and they sketch it, oh yeah, we're doing J2E and you know, we're going to have this WebSphere thing here and it's going to talk to Oracle and you know, whatever the situation is, right? You do some initial modeling. This is normal. Okay? This is what happens. So you do this modeling stuff. During iteration planning, during the planning game, you're doing modeling as well, right? You know, when you're trying to estimate things, you're going to start maybe sketch something on a whiteboard. You whip out the index cards, do some CRC modeling, you know, whatever it takes to understand what that user story is or what that usage scenario is. So you do some initial modeling at the beginning of an iteration. You do model storming throughout the iteration. So you'll be working on something, you'll realize, oh, I got to, you know, I'll be pair programming or whatever, and I realize, how are we going to build this? So you go to the whiteboard, you go to your index cards or whatever, and you start drawing stuff, right? You think you spend 10 or 15 minutes, you think something through, and then you go back and you spend the next couple hours or next couple days doing test-driven development. Perfectly fine, right? So you use modeling for what it's good at, thinking big issues through. You use test-driven development for what it's good at, thinking the detailed issues through, doing just-in-time design or just-in-time requirements. So the Agile modeling stuff is one of the scaling issues for doing test-driven development. Not such a bad thing. We can also do Agile database stuff. You can, in fact, just like you can refactor your code, you can refactor your database schema, at least a relational database schema. So refactoring and changing an existing relational database schema is absolutely trivial if you choose to make it trivial. Okay? Everybody flicks, oh, well, we couldn't possibly rename a column, or couldn't possibly split a column in two because we're using it for multiple things because we're going to break 100 apps. Well, there's ways around that. You don't have to be stupid about it, right? So unfortunately, the data community assumes that it's difficult to do database refactoring. So they never got good at it. The Agile community came along and said, you know what, we need to do this. Let's not assume that let's assume that it's easy and figure it out. And you know what, it is in fact easy. So there's some good material out there. I wrote a fairly decent book on this topic. You can do regression testing of your database. It's absolutely criminal, the level of quality we see in the data community. Right now, data quality problems in the United States is a $600 billion a year problem. $600 billion a year. Hillary Clinton's health care plan is $115 billion. I can pay for health care for Americans 5 times over with the amount of money they waste due to data quality problems. Maybe we want to fix it. Maybe we should test the database. Just like we test our application code, why should we not test our database, right? Think about this. We should do continuous database integration. I don't want to be surprised at the end of a project to find out that things don't integrate. Just like I integrate the code running on my app server, I should also be integrating the stuff that's running in my database, including the source data, right? It's a no-brainer. Obvious that this should be happening. So we got to get good at this. So anyways, the Agile community has been doing a fair bit of work around these topics. Because it's no good if the data folks can't work in an evolutionary manner. If they can't react quickly to change, then it's a wash, right? Because you've got to look at the full life cycle. So if you want to add a new feature, or if you want to fix a defect, whatever it is you happen to be doing, it's no good if it takes the application programmers 2 days to fix their stuff because they're doing TDD and they got high quality code, but it takes 3 months to add that column into the database. Because that's how much fooling around the data guys do, right? It's got to be a couple days at most. So we got to get better at this. So anyways, it is possible if you choose to work that way. The rational unified process has some interesting scaling things for Agile. Everybody flips out about phases. It's interesting. If you read the first book on Kent Beck's book on XP, read the last chapter. He talked about phases. I don't know if anybody's got the book with them. But he talked about phases of XP. And that got dropped because it wasn't a sexy topic to be talking about. But in RUP, we have these different phases. So during inception, so what happens is we're risk-driven. We want to drive out the risk. So in the inception phase, you try to drive out most of your business risk. During the elaboration phase, you drive out your technical risk. So at the end of elaboration, I have a working end-to-end skeleton of the system that proves that the architecture works, right? Yes, things will evolve over time, but the architecture provides the foundation for the system. I want to make sure I get that right. I want to make sure I prove it out. Very simple to do. I don't want to be 9 months into my project and find out my architecture doesn't work. And I've seen Agile teams do this. I've done several Agile rescues now where you go in and you start talking with these guys, and it's always, well, yeah, we were going to evolve, and we're going to have the courage to do things tomorrow, and all that sort of stuff. Well, great, we're a year into the project, and you've got to basically start over again because you went off in the wrong direction. You never refactored your way out of it, right? Well, don't make stupid mistakes. Meanwhile, if you'd spent like a day doing a little bit of upfront modeling, you would have avoided all those mistakes. So let's not do that. So anyways, there's some really good stuff there, and it's interesting. The Agile community will give us grief about the RUP, but the fact is we socialized many of the concepts that the Agile community takes for granted, like delivering working software every iteration, like the word iteration, putting testing throughout the life cycle, doing all the programming and modeling all through the life cycle. So there's some good stuff there. And we also take on some of the not so sexy issues as well, like releasing your software into production. That's nasty, hard work sometimes, right? Because you got to do data conversions, you got to train your end users, you've got to be able to back up your existing data, restore it if you have to. Deploying software into production is hard stuff sometimes. It's not just just copy it onto the server and hope for the best type stuff. So you got to make this stuff explicit. Starting a project up can also be hard, right? Getting the initial funding, not such a pleasant experience if you've ever had to go hat in hand trying to get a project funded, right? But we never talk about these things. We got to get better at that. Question?
Like we need projects at all. How does this tapping into continuous development move?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
So I was asking how would you map this into continuous development?
Well, this is continuous development. So the reality is that, so this is all continuous development here, but just because like the Scrum guys and the XP guys don't like to talk about it, the project has to start somehow, right? Like it's like if you read some of the literature, there's this assumption that you've already started. Well, what about get the funding? What about getting the room, getting the people, all this sort of stuff? There's a lot of work there to be done sometimes. If it's easy, well then this is nothing and you're done, right? But if it's not so easy, it's not. Putting stuff into production, and it's interesting, if you look at some of the processes, they talk about gearing down towards the end of the life cycle, so that way you start getting serious about baselining things and then doing the transition work. So if you have an easy deployment, then this is nothing as well. But that's not always the case. So you need to be explicit about these things. So finally, just to end off here, governance. So I was ranting about governance a while ago. So this is something that's absolutely critical in organizations. So if you've got a very small company, it doesn't matter much. But now that we're on the right-hand side of the adoption chasm, the banks of the world, the insurance companies, the government agencies, the mid to large size organizations, they have to worry about governance. If you've got 40, 50, 500 projects underway every year, you darn well better be looking at the bigger picture, right? Because one of the challenges with Agile is it's far too developer focused and it's far too project focused. So we're unfortunately, a lot of Agile teams are doing a lot of silo development stuff, which is not, from a large company point of view, is not very attractive. So we need to start looking at these bigger pictures. But that doesn't mean we need to be ineffective at it. It doesn't mean we need these big control boards. It doesn't mean we need mounds of documentation. But we do need somebody to be looking at these bigger pictures. So we have to align our HR policies and our IT values, and as well as our stakeholder policies. It's no good being Agile if your business folks come along and say, I absolutely need a detailed upfront estimate, and I absolutely need a detailed upfront requirements document, which you will sign off on, which you will accept. Because if those two business decisions can be the kiss of death for an IT project, right? So yes, Agile will help you recover from those mistakes, but it'd be a lot nicer if you didn't make those mistakes to begin with. And so you need to work with your business people to do that. It's no good if your company decides to have defined roles. So I'm a business analyst. I only write I only talk to the users and I write documentation and I hand it off to the coders, right? That's not good. Right? That's in effect, it's not just a business analyst problem, obviously, but having these defined roles doing their specific specialty is not a very effective way of doing things. This is a challenge. So we need to get smarter about this. When we have compliancy issues, we should automate it as much as possible. I don't want to fill out forms. I don't want to do reviews. I don't want to do a bunch of extra paperwork. I want my tools to automate all this for me. I want this to be as easy as possible. It's not going to be totally automated, but a lot of it can be automated. We need to be collecting some simple metrics. If you're collecting no metrics at all, you're flying blind, right? There's no possible way that your organization can manage your projects. So who cares if if the single projects seem to be doing things well, how do they compare? I don't want to be investing in teams that aren't very effective, right? I'd rather put my money into the teams that are doing really well and starve the teams that aren't doing so well. I need to monitor my projects. If I've got, it's great that you do, that Agilists do retrospectives every iteration so that way they can improve. But what about the rest of the organization? So who cares? It's nice that we've got this Agile team over here doing really well, but why don't we share these ideas with everybody else? Why don't we get better at that? So why don't we start targeting start identifying the projects that seem to be doing really well, and then go and ask them, say, you increase your productivity by 20%. How did you do that? Oh, you're doing TDD. Well, maybe the rest of the team should be doing this too, right? Or whatever it happens to be. So this is what you get. Good things for this is the value out of getting out of good governance. Aligning your team structure with your architecture. So if you've got a larger team or teams of teams, then you want to identify your subsystems and have different teams working on the different subsystems, right? So this is called Conway's Law. Self-organizing teams, a fairly decent thing from the Agile community again. So anyways, having valued corporate assets. All the clients I talked to the last couple of days, everybody talked about reuse, right? Well, the only way you're going to achieve reuse is you have valuable things that people, good quality stuff that people actually want to reuse, including coding guidelines and components and web services and everything else, and you've got to be able to fund that. So if you ask a project team to do reusable stuff, it'll never happen. They don't have the time to do it. So you've got to have ways, you've got to have a reuse program in place. It's got to be separately funded. You've got to make it as easy as possible for people to do the right thing, because the teams themselves will not do it because that's not their primary goal. Okay, you've got to have a specific reuse team who's geared to do reuse and make it as easy as possible. So there's things like this. So this is part. So this is part of your overall governance program. So now this is something that if you're a small company, if you're new at all this, this is not what we want to be looking at today. But you should be, if you've got multiple Agile projects, if you're a couple of years in, if you want to get better, then you got to start looking at your overall portfolio, right? Because it's at the portfolio level that you're really going to start achieving benefits of scale. So these are the sorts of things that we're seeing in practice. So anyways, a few parting thoughts. Look beyond the Agile, look beyond the rhetoric in the IT community in general, but particularly look beyond the Agile rhetoric. There is some questionable things going on in the Agile community right now. So we got to be a little bit smarter about that, and we got to start questioning, because just like the traditional communities made assumptions, so is the Agile community, and we don't have some of the numbers that we should behind some of the things that we do. And some of the things don't work very well in practice, which is why we're seeing the evolution of Agile. There's far more to development than development. I think one of the challenges that we face in the Agile community is that it is too programmer focused. So we've done good things. We've brought discipline to programming. We have made programming a little more mature, but we've also really, it's interesting, some of the conversations that you see, the programmers have sort of digressed in many ways when it comes to the data stuff, when it comes to looking at the bigger picture, when it comes to architecture, things like that. So overall, I think things have improved, but we have made things a little bit worse in some cases. So we need to consider that. If you're doing Agile at scale, consider an Agile form of RUP. Yes, I realize that there's been a lot of challenges with the RUP. A lot of companies instantiate RUP in a traditional documentation heavy, sometimes serial way. That's not right. I don't know what that is. That's not RUP though. RUP done right is Agile. So, and there's been some wonderful case studies, and a lot of organizations have succeeded at that. So there's a bunch of good stuff. I actually blog. Oops. Anyways, oh, there we go. Okay, I actually blog about scaling issues at Developer Work. So if you're interested in some of the some more details, go ahead. I guess we're going to be running a roundtable later on this evening, so I'll be back for that. I've actually got to run out. I got to go visit another client, then I'll be back. But anyways, thank you very much, and I'll hand off to the next speaker.